When power meets prejudice, the Tommy Tuberville story. The rain hammered against the windows of Murphy's diner like an angry drummer, each drop creating rivulets that distorted the neon signs across the street in downtown Montgomery, Alabama. It was one of those southern storms that seemed to come out of nowhere, turning the evening rush into a chaotic mess of honking horns and splashing puddles. Inside the warmly lit diner, the smell of fresh coffee and bacon grease created a comforting bubble against the chaos outside. Sarah Mitchell wiped down the same table for the third time, her movements automatic after 8 years of working at Murphy's. At 28, she had the kind of tired eyes that spoke of too many double shifts and not enough sleep. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her uniform, a powder blue dress with Sarah embroidered on the pocket, had seen better days. The fabric was worn thin at the elbows, and there was a small stain near the hem that no amount of bleach could remove. "Table 6 needs their check," called out Marcus from behind the counter, his deep voice cutting through the dinner rush chatter. Marcus Johnson had been the night manager at Murphy's for 15 years, and he ran the place with the efficiency of a military operation. His dark skin glistened with sweat from the kitchen heat, and his kind eyes missed nothing that happened in his establishment. Sarah nodded, grabbing the check pad from her apron. Table 6 was a young couple on what appeared to be their first date. The telltale signs were all there. The nervous laughter, the way they kept checking their phones, the fact that they'd ordered the cheapest items on the menu. She remembered being that young, that hopeful, before life taught her that dreams were expensive luxuries she couldn't afford. The diner was unusually busy for a Wednesday night. The storm had driven people inside, seeking shelter and comfort food. Every booth was occupied, and the counter seats were full of regulars nursing coffee and sharing gossip. Murphy's wasn't fancy. The vinyl seats had cracks that were held together with duct tape, and the linoleum floor had yellowed with age, but it was honest. It served good food at fair prices, and it didn't judge you based on what you wore or how much money you had in your wallet. Sarah had learned to read people in this job. The businessman in booth 3, loosening his tie after a long day, would tip exactly 15%. The elderly woman at the counter, counting change from her worn purse, would leave her leftover biscuit wrapped in a napkin, not because she wasn't hungry, but because she was saving it for later. The construction workers in the corner booth would be loud but harmless, and they'd clean their plates because they knew what it meant to work for their food. "Sarah, honey, could you bring me some more of that honey butter?" called out Mrs. Rodriguez from booth 2. She was a regular, coming in every Wednesday after her shift at the hospital. Sarah had served her countless meals over the years, had listened to stories about her grandchildren, had even helped her count out exact change when money was tight between paychecks. "Of course, Mrs. Rodriguez," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of professional hospitality mixed with genuine affection. She retrieved a small dish of honey butter from the kitchen, pausing to check on the elderly woman's meal. "How's the meatloaf tonight?" "Perfect as always, dear. You tell Chef Bobby I said so." Mrs. Rodriguez's weathered hands patted Sarah's arm affectionately. "You working another double shift?" Sarah nodded, trying to hide the exhaustion in her smile. "Rent's due Monday, and Jamie needs new shoes for school." She didn't mention that her 8-year-old son was wearing shoes with holes in them, or that she'd been putting cardboard in the bottom to make them last until her next paycheck. Pride was sometimes all she had left. The bell above the door chimed, and Sarah glanced up to see 2 men entering, shaking rain from their coats. They were clearly not locals. Their clothes were too expensive, their posture too confident. The older of the 2 was probably in his late 60s, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that suggested authority. He wore a navy suit that looked custom-tailored, and his shoes had the kind of shine that came from professional care, not a quick brush at home. His companion was younger, maybe mid-40s, dressed in a charcoal suit with a red tie. He carried himself like someone accustomed to being the second most important person in the room, comfortable in that role, but always ready to step up when needed. He scanned the diner with the practiced eye of someone whose job it was to assess situations and potential problems. Sarah grabbed 2 menus and approached them. "Evening, gentlemen. Just the 2 of you tonight?" The older man smiled, a politician's smile, Sarah noticed, the kind that was warm but somehow calculated. "Yes, thank you. Somewhere quiet if you have it." Sarah looked around the crowded diner. The only available spot was a small booth in the back corner, near the kitchen. It wasn't ideal. It was close to the swinging doors and could be noisy, but it was what she had. "I can seat you back here," she said, leading them to the booth. "It's a bit close to the kitchen, but it's all we have right now." The older man slid into the booth, his companion taking the seat across from him. Sarah noticed the way the younger man positioned himself, facing the door, back to the wall. Professional habit, she guessed. Maybe they were lawyers or business executives from Montgomery or Birmingham, down in the area for meetings. "Can I start you gentlemen off with something to drink?" she asked, placing the menus on the table. "Coffee, black," said the older man. "Same," added his companion. Sarah poured their coffee from a fresh pot, the aroma mixing with the ambient smells of the diner. As she set down the cups, she noticed the older man checking his phone with a slight frown. Important people always seemed to be checking their phones, she'd observed over the years. Always somewhere else they needed to be, something else that demanded their attention. "Take your time with the menus," she said. "I'll be back in a few minutes to take your order." As she walked away, she heard the younger man speak in low tones to his companion. "Senator, we really should get going soon." "The flight to Washington." "I know, David," the older man replied quietly. "Just let me eat something. It's been a long day." "Senator." Sarah filed that information away without much interest. Alabama had several state senators, and they all looked the same to her. Older white men in expensive suits who made decisions about other people's lives from the comfort of their offices. She had more pressing concerns, like making sure Table 4 got their order right, and that the new busboy remembered to refill the salt and pepper shakers. The dinner rush was in full swing now. Orders were backing up in the kitchen, and Sarah could hear Chef Bobby muttering colorful commentary about the pace. Her feet ached in her worn sneakers, and she could feel the beginning of one of her stress headaches building behind her eyes. She grabbed the coffee pot for another round of refills, weaving between tables with the practiced grace of someone who had navigated crowded spaces with hot liquids thousands of times. "Sarah," called out Marcus from behind the register. "Table 12 needs extra napkins, and the gentleman in booth 7 wants to know if we have any sugar-free pie." "On it!" she called back, adding those tasks to her mental list. She delivered napkins to table 12, a family with 3 young children who had somehow managed to get syrup on everything within a 3-foot radius, and broke the disappointing news about the pie to booth 7. Murphy's Diner was many things, but health-conscious wasn't one of them. When she finally made it back to the 2 men in the corner booth, they had closed their menus and were deep in quiet conversation. As she approached, she caught fragments of their discussion. "The vote on the military budget is going to be close," the older man was saying. "The opposition is stronger than we anticipated," replied his companion, "especially from the progressive wing." "We'll make it work," the older man said with confidence. "We always do." Political talk. Sarah had heard enough of it over the years to recognize the patterns. Politicians loved to come into places like Murphy's during campaign season, eating pie and talking to regular folks for photo opportunities. They'd shake hands, make promises they never intended to keep, and then disappear back to their comfortable lives until the next election cycle. "Have you decided what you'd like tonight?" she asked, pulling out her order pad. The older man looked up at her, and for a moment she was struck by the intensity of his gaze. His eyes were steel blue, and they seemed to take in everything: her tired posture, her worn uniform, the way she unconsciously rubbed her left temple where the headache was building. "What do you recommend?" he asked. "The meatloaf is good," Sarah said automatically. "Comes with mashed potatoes and green beans. The chicken fried steak is popular too, though it's pretty heavy." She paused, studying their expensive clothes. "We also have a nice salmon if you're looking for something lighter." The younger man, David, she remembered, glanced at his watch. "Maybe just something quick, a sandwich?" "The club sandwich is good," Sarah offered. "Turkey, bacon, lettuce, tomato. Comes with fries." "That sounds fine," the older man said. "And maybe some of that pie if you have it. What kinds do you have tonight?" "Apple, pecan, and chocolate cream," Sarah recited. She'd said those words so many times they felt automatic. "Pecan, please." Make that 2 club sandwiches and 2 pieces of pecan pie," David added. Sarah scribbled down the order. "Anything else to drink besides coffee?" "Water would be good," the older man said. "Thank you." As Sarah walked away to submit their order, she noticed the diner was beginning to thin out slightly. The storm outside seemed to be lessening, and the worst of the dinner rush was passing. A few tables had cleared, giving her a brief moment to catch her breath. She stopped at the coffee station to refill the pot, using the brief pause to roll her shoulders and stretch her neck. 8 years of this work had left its mark on her body. Aching feet, a persistent pain in her lower back, and hands that were rough from constant washing and sanitizing. But it was honest work, and it paid the bills. Mostly. "Sarah, your order's up," called Chef Bobby from the kitchen window. She grabbed the plates, 2 perfectly assembled club sandwiches with golden fries and pickles on the side, and headed back to the corner booth. The 2 men were still talking quietly, but they paused their conversation as she approached. She set down their plates with practiced efficiency, ensuring everything was positioned correctly. "Can I get you gentlemen anything else?" she asked. "This looks great," the older man said, examining his sandwich. "Thank you." Sarah nodded and turned to leave, but something made her pause. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe it was the stress of another bill-heavy week. But she found herself looking more closely at the 2 men. There was something familiar about the older one, something that nagged at the edge of her memory. "Excuse me," she said, surprising herself with her boldness. "Have we met before? You look familiar." The older man looked up from his sandwich, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I don't think so. I'm not from around here." "Oh," Sarah felt foolish for asking. "Well, enjoy your meal." As she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd seen his face somewhere before, maybe in the newspaper or on the local news. But then again, most politicians looked the same to her, interchangeable figures in expensive suits, making speeches about problems they'd never personally experienced. The next hour passed in the usual blur of refills, orders, and cleared tables. Sarah found herself checking on the 2 men periodically, ensuring their coffee stayed full and their needs were met. They seemed pleasant enough, if a bit formal. The older man had good table manners and said please and thank you, small courtesies that meant more than he probably realized in a job where people often treated servers as invisible. When they finished their meal, David signaled for the check. Sarah quickly calculated their total and brought it over, placing the small folder on the table between them. "Take your time," she said. "No rush." The older man reached for his wallet, an expensive leather piece that probably cost more than Sarah made in a week. As he pulled out his credit card, Sarah caught a glimpse of his driver's license in the clear window of the wallet. The photo was small, but something about the name made her look twice. Thomas Tuberville. The name hit her like a physical blow. She knew that name. She'd seen it in the news, heard it discussed on the radio during her commute to work. Tommy Tuberville, the former Auburn football coach turned United States Senator, The man who had made headlines with his controversial statements, his voting record, his positions on issues that directly affected people like her. Sarah felt her face flush as the recognition fully sank in. This wasn't just any politician. This was Tommy Tuberville, one of the most polarizing figures in Alabama politics. The man who had voted against raising the minimum wage, who had opposed expanded healthcare coverage, who had consistently sided with policies that made life harder for working families like hers. She stood frozen for a moment, the implications cascading through her mind. Here he was, sitting in her section, eating the same food as everyone else, acting like a normal person while his votes in Washington made her life and the lives of countless others more difficult every day. The irony wasn't lost on her. He was probably making more in a single day as a senator than she made in 6 months of double shifts and aching feet. He could afford to eat anywhere in Montgomery, at one of those fancy steakhouses downtown, where a single meal cost more than her weekly grocery budget, but here he was at Murphy's, probably slumming it for some political purpose she couldn't fathom. Sarah felt something burning in her chest, anger, frustration, years of barely scraping by while men like him made decisions that kept people like her struggling. She thought about Jamie's shoes with holes in them, about the stack of medical bills from his last asthma attack, about the nights she'd stayed awake, wondering how she was going to make rent and buy groceries in the same week. Without fully realizing what she was doing, Sarah found herself walking back toward their table. Her hands were trembling slightly, and her heart was beating faster than it should have been. She had never been one for confrontation. Her job required her to be pleasant, accommodating, to smile even when customers were rude or dismissive. But something about seeing Tommy Tuberville sitting there, acting like just another customer, had ignited something in her that she couldn't suppress. As she approached their booth, both men looked up expectantly, probably assuming she was coming to process their payment or ask if they needed anything else. The ordinary politeness of the moment felt surreal, given the storm of emotions building inside her. "Senator Tuberville," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The effect of her words was immediate. Both men straightened, and she saw David's hand instinctively move toward his jacket, a security detail's automatic response. Tommy Tuberville's expression shifted from mild curiosity to wariness, the practiced politician's mask sliding into place. "Yes?" he said carefully. Sarah stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of 8 years of exhaustion, of struggling to make ends meet, of watching her son go without things he needed, while men in expensive suits made speeches about family values from their comfortable positions of power. "I know who you are," she said quietly. The diner around them seemed to fade into the background. Other conversations continued. The kitchen kept cooking. Marcus continued managing the front of the house. But for Sarah, the world had narrowed to this booth, this man, and the words that were building pressure inside her chest like steam in a kettle. Tommy Tuberville nodded slowly. "I see." "Do you?" Sarah asked, her voice gaining strength. "Do you really see?" The storm outside had passed, but inside Murphy's diner, a different kind of storm was just beginning. The silence that followed Sarah's words stretched between them like a taut wire. In the background, the normal sounds of the diner continued. The clink of silverware against plates, the hiss of the coffee machine, the soft murmur of conversations. But at table 15 in the corner, time seemed suspended. Tommy Tuberville's steel blue eyes studied Sarah's face with the calculation of a man who had spent years navigating political minefields. He could see the exhaustion etched in the lines around her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged with fatigue, the defensive posture of someone who had been knocked down too many times but was still standing. Most importantly, he could see the anger. Not the hot, explosive kind, but the deep, burning resentment of someone who had been overlooked and undervalued for too long. "Yes," he said finally, his voice measured. "I think I do see." Sarah's laugh was hollow, bitter. No, Senator, I don't think you do. You see a waitress in a small-town diner. You see someone whose job it is to smile and bring you food and make sure your coffee cup never gets empty. But you don't see the person working 2 jobs just to keep a roof over her kid's head. You don't see someone who lies awake at night wondering if she can afford her son's asthma medication and still pay the electric bill. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting between Sarah and his boss. This wasn't part of the plan. They were supposed to grab a quick meal during the layover, maybe take a few photos with locals if the opportunity arose. Standard political theater. They weren't supposed to encounter an angry constituent ready to air grievances in a public place. "Ma'am," David began, his voice taking on the diplomatic tone of damage control, "perhaps this isn't the best place." "Oh, this is exactly the right place," Sarah cut him off, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and glanced around the diner. She lowered her voice, but kept the intensity. "This is where real people eat, Senator. People who work for every dollar they make. People whose lives are affected by every vote you cast in Washington." Tommy Tuberville leaned back in the booth, his expression unreadable. 30 years of coaching had taught him how to handle confrontation, how to read people under pressure. Another decade in politics had refined those skills, but this was different. This wasn't a hostile reporter or an opposing coach or even a political rival. This was a woman whose life had been shaped by the very policies he'd supported, standing 3 feet away from him with nothing to lose and everything to say. "You voted against raising the minimum wage," Sarah continued, her voice steady now, finding its rhythm. $7.25 an hour, Senator. Do you know what that works out to after taxes? Do you have any idea what it's like to budget every single dollar, to choose between buying groceries and putting gas in your car? Around the diner, other customers were beginning to notice the tension at table 15. Conversations were getting quieter, and Sarah could feel eyes turning their direction. Marcus looked up from the register with concern, recognizing the shift in atmosphere that meant trouble might be brewing. "I understand your concerns," Tommy said carefully, "but the economic realities..." "Economic realities," Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "The economic reality is that I work 40 hours a week here and another 20 at the gas station on weekends. And I still can't afford to take my son to the doctor when he gets sick. The economic reality is that I've been wearing the same pair of shoes for 2 years because buying new ones means we don't eat meat for a week." She was fully aware now that she was making a scene, that this confrontation could cost her job, that Murphy's couldn't afford to have servers antagonizing customers, especially important ones. But 8 years of swallowing her pride, of accepting less than she deserved, of watching wealthy politicians make decisions about her life from their ivory towers, had built up to this moment. "The last time you voted on healthcare legislation," she continued, "you voted against expanding Medicaid coverage. My son has asthma, Senator. Do you know how much an inhaler costs? $60 for something he needs to breathe. And your vote helped ensure that families like mine don't get the help we need to afford basic medical care." Tommy Tuberville felt the familiar weight of political pressure, but this was different from the usual confrontations he faced. In Washington, his opponents were other politicians, people who understood the game, who fought with amendments and parliamentary procedures. This was raw, personal, immediate. This woman wasn't fighting for political advantage. She was fighting for survival. "Ma'am," he said, his voice softer now, "I know these are difficult times for working families, but government solutions aren't always government solutions." Sarah interrupted. "You are the government, Senator. Your decisions have consequences for real people. When you vote against programs that help working families, it's not some abstract policy debate. It's my son going to school in shoes with holes in them. It's me deciding whether to fill a prescription or pay the electric bill. David was frantically trying to signal his boss to end this conversation, to pay the check and leave before the situation escalated further. He could see other customers openly watching now, some with their phones out. In the age of social media, this kind of confrontation could be online and viral within minutes. But Tommy Tuberville surprised him. Instead of cutting the conversation short, instead of falling back on political talking points or deflecting with promises to take her concerns under advisement, he looked directly at Sarah and said, "Tell me about your son." The request caught Sarah off guard. She had expected defensiveness, political spin, maybe even dismissal. She hadn't expected genuine curiosity. "His name is Jamie," she said, her anger mixing now with something more vulnerable. "He's 8 years old. He loves baseball and video games and wants to be a veterinarian when he grows up. He's smart, scary smart sometimes. He reads books that are meant for kids twice his age." She paused, looking down at her hands. They were red and rough from years of washing dishes and handling cleaning chemicals, nails cut short and practical. "His father left when Jamie was 2, she continued, "said he wasn't ready for the responsibility. So it's been just us ever since. I want to give him everything, piano lessons, baseball equipment, trips to the zoo in Birmingham. But most months, I'm just trying to keep us afloat. And when you vote against things that could help families like ours..." She trailed off, suddenly aware of how exposed she had made herself. This was Tommy Tuberville, a United States Senator, and she was telling him about her personal struggles as if he were a friend, as if he cared about the individual lives affected by his political decisions. "I'm sorry," she said, stepping back slightly. "I shouldn't have. This isn't professional of me." "Don't apologize," Tommy said firmly. "Don't you dare apologize for speaking up." The response surprised her. She had expected him to dismiss her concerns or offer empty platitudes about understanding her struggles. Instead, he seemed genuinely engaged, leaning forward in the booth as if her words mattered. "You said I voted against the minimum wage increase," he said. "You're right, I did. And I voted against the Medicaid expansion. You want to know why?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. "Because I believed that government programs create dependency rather than opportunity. That the best way to help people is to create jobs, to encourage business growth, to let the free market lift everyone up." He paused, looking around the diner. "But sitting here, listening to you, I'm wondering if I've been living in a bubble." David looked alarmed at this admission. Politicians weren't supposed to express doubt about their positions, especially not to constituents with phones who might record every word. "Senator," he said quietly, "we really should." "No," Tommy said without taking his eyes off Sarah. "This is important." He turned back to her. "How long have you been working here?" 8 years, Sarah replied. "Started right after Jamie was born. Marcus gave me a chance when no one else would hire a single mother with no experience." "And in those 8 years, how many raises have you gotten?" Sarah's laugh was bitter. 2. 25 cents each time. So I went from $7.25 to $7.75 an hour. The cost of everything else, rent, groceries, gas, utilities, has gone up every year, but my pay has basically stayed the same." Tommy nodded slowly. "And the job at the gas station?" "Weekends, some evenings when Marcus can cover for me here, minimum wage there too, but it's extra hours. Jamie stays with my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, when I'm working both jobs. She doesn't charge me much, but..." She shrugged, the gesture conveying volumes about the constant juggling act of her life. What would happen if the minimum wage was raised to, say, $12 an hour? Tommy asked. Sarah looked at him suspiciously, wondering if this was some kind of political trap. "Are you serious?" "I'm serious." She did quick math in her head, a skill she'd developed out of necessity. That would be almost $5 more per hour. For a 40-hour week, that's... She paused, calculating. About $200 more per week before taxes, $800 more per month. And what would you do with that extra money? What would I do with it? Sarah's voice rose again, incredulous. I'd buy my son shoes that don't have holes in them. I'd take him to the doctor when he's sick, instead of hoping it gets better on its own. I'd maybe put some money in savings so that when the car breaks down, I don't have to choose between fixing it and buying groceries. She was gaining momentum again, the personal nature of the question unlocking her frustration. I'd buy him books, Senator. Real books, not just the ones from the library. I'd sign him up for Little League so he could play baseball with kids his age instead of just throwing a ball against the wall in our backyard. I'd take him to the movies sometimes or out for pizza like a normal family. Tommy Tuberville had been listening intently, but now he was quiet, processing what he'd heard. The abstract policy positions he'd held, the belief that market forces and business incentives would naturally improve workers' conditions, were colliding with the concrete reality of Sarah's life. You know what else I'd do? Sarah continued. I'd work less. Maybe I could quit the weekend job at the gas station and actually spend time with my son. Maybe we could have dinner together more than twice a week. Maybe I could help him with his homework instead of falling asleep on the couch, still in my uniform. The pain in her voice was evident now, the exhaustion of years of sacrifice and struggle. Around the diner, the other customers had returned to their own conversations, but the tension at table 15 remained thick. And the healthcare? Tommy asked quietly. If Alabama had expanded Medicaid like other states did, Jamie would be covered, Sarah said. His asthma would be managed properly, instead of me rationing his medication and praying he doesn't have a bad attack. I could take him for regular checkups, catch problems before they become emergencies. She paused, looking directly at him. Do you have children, Senator? Yes, Tommy replied. 2 sons and a daughter. All grown now. Did you ever have to choose between their health and paying rent? The question hung in the air between them. Tommy Tuberville had raised his children in comfortable middle-class circumstances, had been able to provide them with opportunities and security that Sarah could only dream of giving Jamie. The contrast was stark and uncomfortable. No, he said honestly, I never had to make that choice. Then you don't understand what your votes mean to people like me, Sarah said simply. When you vote against programs that help working families, you're not just making an abstract policy decision. You're deciding that families like mine don't deserve better, that a single mother working 2 jobs isn't worthy of help. The accusation stung because Tommy could hear the truth in it. He had made those votes based on principles and theories about free markets and limited government, but he had never really considered their human cost. The faces behind the policies had remained abstract, statistical rather than personal. I think, he said slowly, that I owe you an apology. Sarah blinked, taken aback. She had expected defensiveness, political spin, maybe even anger at being challenged so directly. She hadn't expected contrition from a United States senator. I don't want an apology, she said. I want change. Tommy Tuberville nodded, understanding for perhaps the first time the real weight of the position he held, the power to affect lives like Sarah's, like Jamie's, and the responsibility that came with that power. The storm outside had passed completely now, but inside Murphy's diner, the real conversation was just beginning. Marcus had been watching the interaction at table 15 with growing concern. 20 years in the restaurant business had taught him to read situations, and this one was heading toward dangerous territory. He could see Sarah's posture, the way she held herself when she was angry and trying not to show it. He could see the expensive suits and uncomfortable body language of the 2 men in the corner booth. Most importantly, he could see the other customers beginning to pay attention, phones being discreetly positioned, conversations tapering off. He made his way over slowly, wiping his hands on his apron, a gesture that was more nervous habit than necessity. As the manager, it was his job to keep the peace, to ensure that Murphy's remained a comfortable place for everyone. But Sarah had been like family to him for 8 years, and he knew her well enough to understand that whatever was happening here was important to her. "Everything all right over here?" he asked casually, though his dark eyes were alert and concerned. Sarah turned toward him, and Marcus could see the mix of anger and vulnerability in her expression. She was at a crossroads, he realized. She could back down, apologize for the disturbance, and return to her tables, or she could continue this confrontation with whatever consequences might follow. "It's fine, Marcus," she said, but her voice betrayed her. "Just having a conversation with the senator here." Marcus's eyebrows raised slightly. He had suspected these weren't ordinary customers from the moment they walked in, but he hadn't realized exactly how unordinary they were. A United States Senator in Murphy's Diner was unprecedented, and Sarah confronting him was potentially catastrophic for business. "Senator Tuberville," David interjected, seizing the opportunity to regain control of the situation. "Perhaps we should—" "No," Tommy said firmly, his eyes still on Sarah. "Marcus, is it?" He looked at the name tag pinned to Marcus's shirt. "How long have you worked here?" 20 years, sir," Marcus replied cautiously. 15 as manager. "And Sarah? She's been with us 8 years, one of our best." Marcus's protective instincts were kicking in. Whatever was happening here, he wasn't going to let Sarah face it alone. Tommy nodded thoughtfully. "She was just telling me about her situation, about working 2 jobs, about her son." He paused. "About how difficult it is to make ends meet on minimum wage." Marcus felt a chill of recognition. He knew Sarah's struggles intimately, had watched her work double shifts while exhausted, had seen her count out exact change for lunch during her breaks, had heard her on the phone with bill collectors during quiet moments. He also knew that Murphy's Diner operated on razor-thin margins, and that paying higher wages would create serious financial challenges for the business. "Sarah works harder than anyone I've ever employed," Marcus said carefully. "She's reliable, professional, and the customers love her, but running a small business—" He trailed off, not wanting to get into the economics of restaurant management in front of customers. "But?" Tommy prompted. Marcus looked uncomfortable. This wasn't a conversation he wanted to have in the middle of the dinner shift, certainly not with a politician who could potentially affect policy that impacted his business. But Sarah was looking at him with an expression that mixed hope and betrayal, and he realized that staying neutral wasn't an option. "But paying everyone $15 an hour would probably force me to cut hours," he admitted, "maybe even lay people off. The profit margins in this business are already tight." Sarah felt like she'd been slapped. She had expected Marcus to support her, to back up her arguments about the need for better wages. Instead, he was essentially arguing for keeping her poor. "So that's it?" she asked, her voice rising. "We're supposed to accept poverty wages because it might be inconvenient for business owners to pay us enough to live on." "Sarah, that's not what Marcus began. "No, that's exactly what you're saying," she interrupted, her 8 years of frustration finally boiling over. "You're saying that my son and I should struggle so that Murphy's can maintain its profit margins. That I should work 80 hours a week and still not be able to afford basic health care because paying me more might affect the bottom line." Other customers were definitely listening now. Conversations had stopped at several tables, and Sarah could feel the weight of their attention. Part of her wanted to retreat, to apologize and return to her tables, to preserve the comfortable dynamics that had kept her employed for 8 years. But a larger part, the part that was tired of being invisible, tired of accepting less than she deserved, pushed her forward. "You know what, Marcus?" she continued, her voice carrying across the diner now. "For 8 years, I've been grateful for this job. Grateful that you hired me when no one else would. Grateful for every 25-cent raise, every extra shift, every small kindness. And I am grateful. You gave me a chance when I needed it most." She paused, looking around the diner at the faces watching her. Customers she'd served countless meals to, co-workers she'd covered shifts for, regulars who knew her name and asked about Jamie. "But gratitude shouldn't mean accepting exploitation," she said. "Gratitude shouldn't mean working 2 jobs and still being unable to afford my son's medication. It shouldn't mean choosing between fixing my car and buying groceries." Tommy Tuberville was watching this exchange with intense focus. The abstract policy debates he engaged in Washington were becoming concrete before his eyes. Here was the real cost of the positions he'd taken, not just for Sarah, but for Marcus too, caught between his desire to treat his employees fairly and the economic realities of running a small business. "Sarah," Marcus said quietly, "you know I care about you and Jamie. If I could pay everyone more, I would. But you can't because the system is rigged," Sarah finished for him. "Because politicians like the senator here vote against policies that would help small businesses afford to pay living wages. Because instead of supporting programs that would make healthcare affordable, or childcare accessible, or education funded properly, they protect the interests of people who already have more money than they could spend in 10 lifetimes." She turned back to Tommy Tuberville, her exhaustion mixing with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. "You want to know what's really frustrating, Senator? It's not just that you vote against things that would help me directly. It's that you vote against things that would help people like Marcus too. Small business tax credits, healthcare subsidies that would make it easier for employers to provide benefits, infrastructure investments that would bring more customers to places like this." Tommy was beginning to understand the interconnected nature of the policies he'd considered in isolation. Sarah wasn't just criticizing his votes on minimum wage or healthcare. She was pointing out how those votes affected entire communities, entire economic ecosystems. "Instead," Sarah continued, "you vote for tax breaks for corporations that already pay their executives millions of dollars. You vote against programs that would help working families while supporting subsidies for industries that don't need them. And then you probably go on TV and talk about supporting small businesses and working families." David was now actively trying to catch his boss's attention, tapping his watch and glancing toward the door. This conversation had gone far beyond what any political handler would consider safe territory. Every word was potential ammunition for opponents, every admission a possible liability. But Tommy Tuberville seemed oblivious to his aide's distress. He was staring at Sarah with the intensity of someone seeing something clearly for the first time. "You're right," he said simply. The words fell into the diner like stones into still water, creating ripples of surprise that spread from table to table. David looked like he might have a heart attack. Marcus blinked rapidly, unsure he'd heard correctly. Sarah herself seemed stunned by the admission. "I'm sorry," she said. "You're right," Tommy repeated louder this time. "About the tax breaks for corporations, about the subsidies for industries that don't need them, about the healthcare programs and the minimum wage." He paused, looking around the diner at the faces watching him. "I've been voting for abstractions instead of people." David was frantically trying to signal that this conversation needed to end immediately. But Tommy continued as if he hadn't noticed. "I've been in Washington for 4 years now," he said, "and I've voted the way I thought was fiscally responsible, the way I thought would create jobs and economic growth. But I never actually talked to the people those votes were supposed to help. I never sat in a place like this and listened to someone like you explain what those policies actually mean in real life." Sarah felt a strange mixture of vindication and disbelief. She had expected to be dismissed, patronized, maybe even asked to leave. She hadn't expected a sitting US senator to admit that his voting record had been wrong. "So, what are you going to do about it?" she asked. The question hung in the air between them. Around the diner, customers were openly listening now, some with their phones recording. Mrs. Rodriguez had set down her fork and was watching with wide eyes. The young couple from table 6 had abandoned their meal entirely, mesmerized by the unfolding drama. Tommy Tuberville looked at Sarah, then at Marcus, then around the diner, at all the faces watching him expectantly. These were his constituents, the people he was supposed to represent, the waitress working 2 jobs to support her son, the manager trying to balance fair wages with business survival, the elderly hospital worker counting change for her dinner, the construction workers tired from a long day of physical labor. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I don't know what I'm going to do about it." The admission was perhaps more shocking than anything else he'd said. Politicians weren't supposed to express uncertainty, weren't supposed to acknowledge that they might not have all the answers. Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of political calculation, for the practiced insincerity she'd come to expect from public figures. But what she saw instead was something that looked almost like confusion, the expression of someone whose fundamental assumptions had been challenged and found wanting. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Tommy nodded. "When you vote on these bills, minimum wage, healthcare, education funding, do you think about people like me? Do you picture faces, families, real situations, or is it all just numbers and theories?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He thought about the briefings he received, the policy papers filled with economic projections and statistical analyses. He thought about the lobbying meetings, the campaign contributions, the pressure from party leadership to vote certain ways. He tried to remember the last time he had considered the human impact of his decisions beyond abstract concepts of job creation and economic growth. "Theories," he said quietly. "Numbers and theories." Sarah nodded, as if this confirmed something she had long suspected. And that's the problem, because when you reduce people's lives to numbers, it becomes easy to make decisions that hurt them. When someone is just a statistic, you don't have to worry about whether they can afford their child's asthma medication or whether they're working themselves to death just to keep a roof over their heads. She looked around the diner at the people she served every day, whose stories she knew, whose struggles she shared. "Everyone in this diner has a story, Senator. Mrs. Rodriguez over there works at the hospital, 12-hour shifts taking care of other people. And she comes here afterward because it's one of the few places she can afford to eat. Those construction workers in the corner, they've been working on the highway project for 6 months and they're worried it'll end before they find their next job. The young couple at table 6, they're both working part-time jobs while going to community college, trying to build a better life." Tommy followed her gaze, really seeing the other customers for the first time since he'd entered. Not as background noise or potential photo opportunities, but as individuals with their own challenges and aspirations. "And you vote on policies that affect all of them," Sarah continued. "When you vote against funding for community colleges, you're voting against that young couple's future. When you vote against infrastructure spending, you're voting against job security for those construction workers. When you vote against healthcare expansion, you're voting against Mrs. Rodriguez being able to afford her own medical care while she takes care of everyone else." Marcus was listening to this exchange with growing amazement. In 8 years, he had never heard Sarah speak so passionately, so articulately about politics. She had always been focused on her work, on taking care of Jamie, on getting through each day. But now she was speaking with the clarity of someone who had lived the consequences of political decisions in ways that most politicians never would. "Sarah," Marcus said softly, "I had no idea you felt so strongly about these things." She turned to him with a sad smile. "Marcus, I think about these things every day. Every time I look at Jamie's shoes and know I can't afford new ones. Every time I calculate whether I can afford to fill his prescription and still buy groceries. Every time I work a double shift and miss his school play because I can't afford to take time off. She looked back at Tommy Tuberville. The difference is, I don't get to vote on policies that could change my situation. I just get to live with the consequences of the votes that people like you make. Tommy felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders in a way it never had before. The abstract notion of representing constituents was becoming personal, immediate, urgent. These weren't just voters to be courted during election season. They were people whose daily lives were shaped by his decisions in Washington. "If you could change one thing," he asked, "what would it be?" Sarah didn't hesitate. "Healthcare," she said immediately. "If I knew that Jamie would always have access to medical care, that I wouldn't have to choose between his health and our survival, everything else would be manageable. I could work one job instead of two. I could spend time with him. I could maybe even save some money for his future." She paused, thinking. "But if I could change everything, I'd want a system where people who work full-time don't have to live in poverty, where a single mother can support her child without working herself to death, where kids like Jamie don't grow up thinking their dreams are too expensive to pursue." Tommy Tuberville sat back in the booth, processing everything he had heard. David was still trying to get his attention, still concerned about the political implications of this conversation. But Tommy was focused entirely on Sarah and the reality she had presented to him. "I need to think about this," he said finally. "About all of this." "Thinking is good," Sarah replied, "but thinking without action is just another form of doing nothing." The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. She had laid out her case, exposed her vulnerabilities, explained the human cost of his political positions. Now she was waiting to see what he would do with that information. Tommy reached for his wallet, but Sarah held up her hand. "Your meal's on the house, Senator," she said. "Consider it an investment in my future." The silence that followed Sarah's gesture stretched across the diner like the calm after a storm. Tommy Tuberville stared at her outstretched hand, still blocking his attempt to pay for the meal, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. This wasn't just about politics anymore, or even about policy. This was about human dignity, about the relationship between those who hold power and those who live with the consequences of that power. "I can't accept that," he said quietly. "Yes, you can," Sarah replied firmly. "Because if my story moves you to actually do something, to vote differently, to think differently about the people your decisions affect, then this meal will be the best investment I've ever made." David finally succeeded in catching his boss's attention, tapping his watch insistently. "Senator, we really need to go. The flight to Washington—" "Cancel it," Tommy said without taking his eyes off Sarah. "Sir?" David's voice cracked slightly. "We can't cancel. You have committee meetings tomorrow, and the vote on the defense appropriations—" "I said cancel it," Tommy repeated more firmly this time. "Reschedule everything for Thursday." David looked like he might faint. Senators didn't just cancel their schedules on a whim, especially not for conversations with constituents in small-town diners. The ramifications would ripple through multiple offices, affecting staff members, other senators, committee schedules, and political strategies that had been planned for weeks. But Tommy Tuberville wasn't thinking about political strategies anymore. He was thinking about Jamie's shoes with holes in them, about Sarah working 80 hours a week and still struggling to afford her son's medication, about the disconnect between the Washington bubble he lived in and the reality of life for most Americans. "Marcus," he said, turning to the manager, "is there somewhere we could sit and talk? Somewhere more private?" Marcus glanced around the diner, weighing his options. The evening rush was winding down, and most of the tables had cleared. In the back, behind the kitchen, there was a small office where he did paperwork and conducted employee meetings. It wasn't much, just a desk, a few chairs and filing cabinets, but it would be private. "There's my office," he offered hesitantly. "It's not fancy, but that would be perfect," Tommy said, standing up from the booth. He looked around the diner, taking in the faces that were still watching him with curiosity and suspicion. "Actually, would it be all right if we all talked? Everyone who wants to be part of the conversation." David looked like he was about to have a nervous breakdown. The idea of an impromptu town hall in the back office of a small-town diner was every political handler's nightmare. There would be no prepared remarks, no vetted questions, no control over the narrative or the outcome. "Senator," he said desperately, "this is highly irregular. Security concerns alone." "David," Tommy interrupted, "how many security threats do you see in this room?" David looked around at the faces surrounding them. Mrs. Rodriguez finishing her meatloaf, the construction workers sharing a piece of apple pie, the young couple holding hands across their table, Marcus wiping down surfaces with practiced efficiency. These weren't threats to national security. These were exactly the people Tommy was supposed to be serving. "None, sir, but—" "Then we're staying," Tommy said decisively. "Sarah, would you be willing to keep talking? To help me understand what I've been missing?" Sarah looked at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. She looked around the diner at customers who had become an inadvertent audience to the most important conversation of her adult life. Many of them were people she had served for years, people whose own struggles she understood intimately. "Yes," she said simply, "I'm willing." Marcus made an announcement to the remaining customers, explaining that anyone who wanted to join a discussion with Senator Tuberville was welcome to come to the back office. To his surprise, nearly everyone stayed. Mrs. Rodriguez carefully wrapped her remaining biscuit and followed the group. The construction workers abandoned their pie and joined in. The young couple exchanged glances and decided this was more interesting than whatever movie they had planned to see later. The back office was cramped with everyone crowded in, but no one seemed to mind. People found places to sit on filing cabinets, leaned against walls, or simply stood in the small space. Tommy took the desk chair, feeling oddly like a student who had been called to the principal's office, while Sarah sat across from him in the only other chair. "I want to understand," Tommy began, looking around the group. "I want to understand how the votes I cast in Washington affect your daily lives." Sarah started to explain, "But I'd like to hear from all of you." Mrs. Rodriguez was the first to speak, her accented English clear and precise. "I work at Montgomery General," she said, 30 years as a nurse's aide. I take care of people who are sick, who are scared, who sometimes die in my arms. And you know what? I can't afford health insurance myself." Tommy frowned. "But surely the hospital provides—" "Part-time employees don't get benefits," Mrs. Rodriguez continued. "They keep us just under full-time hours, so they don't have to provide insurance. So I take care of other people's health all day, and then I pray I don't get sick myself, because I can't afford to be a patient in the same hospital where I work." One of the construction workers, a weathered man in his 50s named Bill, spoke up next. "I've been working construction for 28 years, he said. "Good work, honest work, but every job is temporary. When one project ends, we scramble to find the next one. Sometimes there's weeks or months between jobs, and there's no safety net. Unemployment benefits don't cover the bills, and they run out too fast." He paused, looking directly at Tommy. "You voted against extending unemployment benefits last year. You said it would encourage people not to work. But you know what encourages me to work? Needing to feed my family. The benefits aren't enough to live on. They're just enough to keep us from losing our homes while we look for the next job." The young woman from table 6 introduced herself as Jessica. She was 22, working part-time at a retail store while attending community college, hoping to become a teacher. I work 25 hours a week because my manager won't give me more. If I worked 30 hours, they'd have to provide benefits, she said. I'm taking out student loans to pay for school, even though it's community college, because I can't afford tuition on what I make. My boyfriend works at a warehouse, same situation, part-time hours, no benefits, struggling to afford school. She looked around the room, then back at Tommy. We're doing everything we're supposed to do. We're working. We're going to school. We're trying to build better lives. But the system seems designed to keep us struggling. And when you vote against funding for community colleges or against programs that help students afford school, you're making it harder for people like us to succeed. Tommy listened to each story with growing discomfort. Not because the stories were being told, but because of what they revealed about the impact of his political positions. These weren't abstract policy debates anymore. They were personal accounts of how his votes had affected real people's lives. Marcus shared his perspective as a small business owner, explaining the impossible balance between wanting to pay his employees well and keeping the business profitable enough to survive. I want to give Sarah and everyone else raises, he said. I want to provide health insurance, paid sick leave, all of it, but I'm competing with chain restaurants that can afford to operate at a loss for years to drive independents like me out of business. If I raise my costs too much, I lose customers. If I lose too many customers, I have to close, and then nobody has a job. An elderly man named Frank, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up. He was a retiree, living on Social Security and a small pension from his job at a paper mill that had closed 5 years earlier. You voted to cut Social Security benefits, he said, his voice shaky but determined, said it was necessary to balance the budget. But Social Security isn't a government handout. It's money I paid in for 43 years of work. It's a promise that was made to me and millions of others. He looked around the room, then back at Tommy. I worked in that mill for 4 decades, breathed chemicals that probably took years off my life, injured my back lifting heavy loads, did my job every day because I was told that if I worked hard and played by the rules, I'd be able to retire with dignity. Now you want to break that promise, to balance a budget that includes tax breaks for people who make more in a year than I made in my entire working life. Each story hit Tommy like a physical blow. He had voted on these issues dozens of times, had participated in debates and committee hearings, had given speeches about fiscal responsibility and economic growth. But he had never really understood the human cost of those positions. Sarah had been listening to her neighbors and co-workers share their stories, and she could see the impact they were having on the senator. His politician's mask had completely fallen away, replaced by an expression of genuine distress and growing understanding. Senator, she said quietly, these aren't isolated cases. Everyone in this room is dealing with some version of these problems, and we're not even the worst off. We all have jobs. We all have roofs over our heads. There are people in this community who are struggling even more. Tommy nodded slowly. What do you want me to do? He asked. Specifically, practically. What do you want me to do? The question sparked an immediate response from around the room. People began talking over each other, sharing ideas and frustrations that had been building for years. Vote for the minimum wage increase, said Sarah. Support the Medicaid expansion, added Mrs. Rodriguez. Fund community colleges properly, said Jessica. Protect Social Security, insisted Frank. Help small businesses compete with corporations, said Marcus. Tommy held up his hands for quiet. One at a time, he said. Let's make a list. Let's figure out what legislation is coming up, what votes I can change, what policies we can push for. David, who had been standing in the corner looking increasingly pale, finally spoke up. Senator, with all due respect, you can't just change your entire platform based on one conversation. You have party obligations, donor commitments, a voting record to maintain." "No," Tommy said firmly, turning to face his aide. "I have an obligation to the people I represent, and I've been failing in that obligation." He turned back to the group. "David's right that I can't change everything overnight, but I can start voting differently. I can start asking different questions in committee hearings. I can start pushing for legislation that actually helps working families instead of just talking about it during campaign season." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs that this was political theater, that he was saying what he thought she wanted to hear. But what she saw instead was something she hadn't expected: genuine remorse mixed with determination. "There's going to be a vote next week on a bill that would expand tax credits for working families," she said. "It's not much, but it would help people like me keep more of what we earn." "I'll vote for it," Tommy said without hesitation. "You voted against it in committee last month," David pointed out, his voice strained. "Then I'll change my vote," Tommy replied, "and I'll explain why." The conversation continued for another hour, with Tommy taking notes on his phone, asking questions about specific policies and their real-world impacts. He learned about the gaps in healthcare coverage that left people like Mrs. Rodriguez uninsured despite working in a hospital. He learned about the student debt crisis that was making it impossible for young people like Jessica to pursue education without mortgaging their futures. He learned about the precarious nature of retirement security for workers like Frank, who had played by the rules their entire lives. Most importantly, he learned about the interconnected nature of these problems, how lack of healthcare coverage forced people to work multiple jobs, how inadequate wages made education unaffordable, how the absence of a social safety net created desperation that employers could exploit. By the time the conversation wound down, it was nearly midnight. The diner had long since closed to other customers, but no one seemed to want to leave. Something important had happened in this small back office, something that felt larger than politics or policy. "I want to stay in touch," Tommy said as people began to gather their things. "I want to know how the votes I cast affect your lives. Will you help me with that?" Sarah looked around the room at her neighbors and co-workers, people who had been invisible to the political process for so long that many had stopped believing their voices mattered. "Yes," she said, speaking for all of them. "We'll help you." As they filed out of the office, Tommy caught Sarah's arm gently. "Thank you," he said, "for not letting me walk away, for making me see." Sarah nodded. "Don't thank me yet, Senator. Thank me when you vote to make our lives better." 3 weeks later, Sarah was working the lunch shift at Murphy's when her phone buzzed with a text message from her neighbor. "Turn on C-SPAN," it read. "You need to see this." She glanced around the nearly empty diner. It was the slow period between the breakfast and dinner rushes and caught Marcus's attention. "Can I check something real quick?" she asked, nodding toward the small television mounted in the corner that usually played local news or weather. Marcus nodded, curious. Sarah rarely asked for anything during her shifts, and she had never shown interest in watching TV at work. She grabbed the remote and flipped to C-SPAN, where the Senate floor was in session. The camera was focused on Tommy Tuberville, who was standing at his desk with a stack of papers in his hand. Sarah felt her heart rate quicken as she recognized the scene. He was about to give a speech. "Could you turn that up?" Marcus asked, moving closer to the television. Word of the unusual late-night meeting 3 weeks ago had spread through Montgomery's small community, and everyone at Murphy's had been curious about whether anything would come of it. "Mr. President," Tommy's voice came through the television speakers, formal and serious. "I rise today to speak about the Working Families Tax Relief Act and to explain why I will be voting differently than I have in the past on legislation of this kind." Sarah set down the coffee pot she had been holding and gave the television her full attention. Around the diner, the few customers who were present had also turned to watch, drawn by the unusual sight of a local waitress fixated on a Senate proceeding. 3 weeks ago, Tommy continued, I had a conversation that changed my perspective on the role of government and the responsibility I have to the people I represent. I was having dinner at a local establishment in Montgomery when I was approached by a constituent, a hard-working single mother who serves food to others while struggling to afford food for her own family. Sarah felt her cheeks flush. She hadn't expected him to mention her specifically, certainly not on the Senate floor. This woman, let's call her Sarah, told me about working 2 jobs and still being unable to afford her son's asthma medication. She told me about choosing between fixing her car and buying groceries. She told me about the reality of life on minimum wage, something I had never experienced personally. The camera pulled back to show other senators in the chamber, some listening intently, others working at their desks or speaking quietly with staff members. But Tommy continued, his voice gaining strength. Sarah challenged me to think about the human impact of my votes. She asked me whether I picture faces and families when I consider legislation, or whether I think only in terms of numbers and theories. I had to admit that it was the latter. Marcus moved closer to Sarah, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. He could see the emotion building in her expression as she watched the speech unfold. Since that conversation, Tommy continued, I have made it my business to learn more about the real-world effects of the policies I support or oppose. I have visited with working families in my state. I have listened to small business owners trying to balance fair wages with economic survival. I have heard from retirees living on fixed incomes, from students struggling to afford education, from parents rationing their children's medication because they cannot afford the cost. He paused, looking around the chamber. What I have learned is that my votes have consequences that extend far beyond the economic theories and fiscal projections that typically guide my decisions. When I vote against raising the minimum wage, I am voting to keep families like Sarah's in poverty despite their full-time work. When I vote against healthcare expansion, I am voting to maintain a system where people choose between medical care and basic necessities. Several senators were now paying closer attention, and Sarah could see C-SPAN had switched to a wider camera angle to capture the growing interest in the chamber. The Working Families Tax Relief Act would provide refundable tax credits to workers earning less than $50,000 per year, Tommy explained. For someone like Sarah, this would mean an additional $2,000 per year, money that could pay for her son's medication or new shoes, or maybe even allow her to work 1 job instead of 2. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. $2,000 might not sound like much to a U.S. senator, but to her, it represented security she had never known. It was the difference between survival and actually living. I have opposed similar legislation in the past because I believed it would increase government spending without addressing the root causes of economic inequality, Tommy continued. But I've come to understand that sometimes government action is necessary to correct market failures, and that providing immediate relief to struggling families is not just compassionate policy, it is economic policy. Sinai, he looked directly into the camera now, and Sarah had the strange sensation that he was speaking directly to her. When working families have more money to spend, they spend it in their local communities. They shop at local businesses, eat at local restaurants, purchase goods and services that support local jobs. The money doesn't disappear into offshore accounts or stock buybacks. It circulates through the economy, creating demand and opportunity. The speech continued for another 10 minutes, with Tommy providing detailed arguments for the legislation and addressing common objections from his colleagues. But what struck Sarah most was the change in his tone and approach. Instead of abstract economic theories, he spoke about specific impacts on real people. Instead of fiscal concerns divorced from human costs, he connected budget decisions to family stability. When he finished and returned to his seat, the chamber erupted in a mix of applause and murmurs. Sarah could see other senators approaching Tommy, some looking supportive, others appearing confrontational. Marcus turned off the television and looked at Sarah with a mixture of pride and amazement. "That was incredible," he said. "He actually listened. He actually changed." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, still processing what she had witnessed. "I can't believe he mentioned me by name." "Well, sort of." "You should be proud," Marcus said. "You did something important that night. You made a difference." But Sarah wasn't entirely convinced yet. She had heard politicians make speeches before, had seen them take positions during campaigns, only to abandon them once in office. Talk was easy. Votes were what mattered. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Mrs. Rodriguez, watching the senator on TV. "Did you really make this happen?" Over the next few hours, Sarah received similar messages from others who had been in the diner that night, from neighbors who had heard about the conversation, from people she barely knew who had somehow learned of her role in Tommy Tuberville's apparent transformation. The attention made her uncomfortable. She wasn't used to being the center of any story, let alone one playing out on national television. But there was something else mixed in with her discomfort, a sense of agency she had never experienced before. For the first time in her adult life, she felt like her voice had been heard, like her perspective had mattered in some larger conversation about the kind of society she wanted her son to grow up in. The lunch rush picked up, and Sarah threw herself into her work with renewed energy. But throughout the afternoon, customers kept mentioning the speech, asking if she had really confronted a U.S. senator, wanting to know what had happened that night 3 weeks ago. "All I did was tell the truth," she told them. "I told him what life is really like for people like us." Late in the afternoon, as Sarah was refilling salt shakers during a lull between rushes, her phone rang. The caller ID showed a Washington, D.C. area code. "Hello?" she answered hesitantly. "Sarah, this is Tommy Tuberville." She nearly dropped the phone. "Senator? I wanted you to know that the bill passed," he said, and she could hear satisfaction in his voice. 62 to 38. We got 12 Republicans to cross over, including 3 who said they were influenced by my speech. Sarah felt her knees go weak and sat down heavily in the nearest booth. "It passed. It passed. The tax credits will start showing up in paychecks within 6 months." He paused. "Sarah, I want you to know that this is just the beginning. There's a healthcare bill coming up next month, and I'm working with Democrats to find a compromise that expands coverage without completely overhauling the system." "Senator, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. You already said everything that needed to be said." His voice became more serious. "I also want you to know that there are people in Washington who are not happy with me right now. Party leadership, donors, special interest groups, they're all concerned about my change in direction." Sarah felt a stab of guilt. She hadn't intended to create problems for him, had just wanted him to understand the human impact of his decisions. "I'm sorry," she began, but he cut her off. "Don't be sorry. They're unhappy because I'm finally doing the job I was elected to do, representing the people of Alabama, not special interests. And I couldn't have done it without you." Now, after they hung up, Sarah sat in the empty booth for several minutes, staring at her phone. The conversation felt surreal, like something that happened to other people, not to single mothers working double shifts in small-town diners. Marcus found her there 20 minutes later, when the dinner rush was about to begin. "You okay?" he asked, sliding into the booth across from her. "Marcus," she said slowly, "what do you think about people who work here making $15 an hour?" His eyebrows shot up. $15? "Sarah, you know I'd love to pay everyone more, but..." What if there were tax credits for small businesses that paid living wages? She continued. What if there were programs to help with health insurance costs? Marcus studied her face, recognizing the same determination that had led her to confront a U.S. senator 3 weeks earlier. "You're not done, are you?" he said. "This isn't the end of it for you." Sarah looked around the diner, at the worn vinyl booths, at the customers starting to file in for dinner, at the life she had built through sheer determination and countless hours of hard work. Then she thought about Jamie, about the future she wanted to give him, about the possibility that things could actually change for families like theirs. "No," she said, standing up and reaching for her order pad. "I don't think I'm done." 6 months later, Sarah received her first paycheck that included the working family's tax relief credit. The additional money wasn't enough to transform her life overnight, but it was enough to buy Jamie new shoes without choosing between that and groceries. It was enough to take him to the doctor when his asthma flared up without panicking about the cost. It was enough to let her cut back to one job and spend more time helping him with homework. But more importantly, it was proof that her voice had mattered, that speaking up had consequences, that change was possible when people were willing to tell their stories and demand better. She kept the stub from that first enhanced paycheck in her wallet, right next to a photo of Jamie at his first Little League game. New cleats, new glove, big smile. It reminded her that democracy wasn't just about elections and politicians, but about ordinary people finding the courage to speak truth to power and demand that their government work for them instead of against them. The conversation at Murphy's Diner had lasted only a few hours, but its effects would ripple through legislation, through lives, and through the understanding of what it meant to truly represent the people for years to come. Tommy Tuberville went on to become one of the most effective bipartisan voices in the Senate, known for his willingness to change his positions based on evidence and constituent input. He never forgot the lesson Sarah had taught him that stormy Wednesday night, that behind every policy debate were real people with real struggles, and that his job was to serve them, not the other way around. And Sarah, she never stopped speaking up. She testified before state committees, attended town halls, and organized her community around issues that mattered to working families. She discovered that her voice, amplified by others like her, could move mountains, or at least move senators. Sometimes the most powerful conversations happen in the most ordinary places, between people who seem to have nothing in common except their shared humanity. Sometimes a waitress can teach a senator what public service really means. And sometimes, just sometimes, speaking truth to power can change everything. The end.